Today I'm going to show you how to easily repair small, medium and large holes in your walls. And if you're watching in the UK, why it's going to be easier for you to do that compared to our American cousins for something that never seems to be discussed on YouTube. Whether you're moving out of rented accommodation and just want to make sure you get 100% of your deposit back, or you're just doing some redecoration, one of the most common DIY jobs around the home is filling holes in walls and making good. And most of the time, we've actually caused them by putting in a fix-in for a mirror or a picture or maybe a shelf or something like that. Every now and again, they're a little bit more sizable and can be classed as a medium-sized hole and means a different approach. And then there's some occasions where the hole is substantially bigger and again a different technique is needed, which we'll look at in a minute. But 99.9% of all holes are going to be small. So let's look at these first. And when you first come across a hole that you need to fill, the chances are it's not actually a hole. The chances are there's normally something in it. And I've got 4 examples of pretty standard fixings here in this mock-up. 2 I would call raw plug type, 6mm and an 8mm. I've got an aluminium fixing here, the type that actually cuts its own hole, and all you do is drill that in. I've also got a plastic fixing here that you can only really see a ring of, but before you put it in, it looks a bit like that. You squeeze it together, you put it through the hole, and as it ties nice and tight, it basically clamps on the back of the plasterboard. So before just pulling these out to start filling them, have a little bit of a think about how pulling them out is going to potentially damage a plaster, because the last thing we want to do at the moment is make these holes any worse. There are a couple of little tricks that you can use to help yourself at this stage. The first of which, rather than pulling that out and making a bigger hole around the plasterboard and potentially the plaster that's on top of this, just get a screw or a nail or a hole punch and instead just push it inside and you never see the thing again. So rather than ripping that paper, by pushing it in actually makes a smaller hole. And this is the real life example that you would have seen me use just a few weeks ago when I was doing some painting on my friend's apartment. It can be far more successful pushing fixings into the cavity to never be seen again, rather than to try to pull them out and actually bring a load of plaster with you. And where you've got fixings like these that you just can't push in because there's actually a flange that will stop you pushing the fixing in, then I would recommend just popping in a screw, just a couple of turns, and then just using a pair of pliers, but having something to protect the rest of the plasterboard. Just pull that out and lever it out the best you can with damaging as little as possible. And then anything that's sticking up, you can actually push in with the end of a filling knife like this, just to make sure that there's nothing sticking above the surface. And sometimes you can't just push fixings into the void. If you're working on a traditional brick wall or a dot and dab wall, there is no void to push the fixings in. So a lot of the time you do have to pull them out. But if you use that method where your pliers aren't bearing on anything, then at least it stops any further damage. Right, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to use to fill these holes. Now, generally on the market, there's 2 different types of products. There's filler that you mix with water. It's a powder that you mix with water. And there's ready mix filler that comes in a tube like this. Now, the one that you mix with water is fairly easy to mix. You start with some water, add the filler to it, just mix it up for a few seconds. Very quickly, you'll understand whether it's too dry or too wet. And then just add a little bit more powder or water just to get to the consistency you want. However, ready mix filler, by definition, is ready mixed and ready to go. So at the weekend, when you get the odd 10 minutes, all you have to do is find the tube and you're off and running, rather than going through the rigmarole of mixing up powder. But there is actually a difference between these products, and that is anything you find in a powdered form that you add water to and then goes hard tends to do that because of a chemical reaction, a bit like adding water to cement. And anything that goes hard once you take it out of a tube does that because it dries out, which means that the ready mix has more of a tendency to shrink than the powdered filler. This may shrink a little bit, but this has got more of a tendency. And what that means is that you can fill a hole, come back 24 hours later, and it's not quite up to surface and you have to do it again. Having said all of that, I know that the most popular filler in the UK is ready mixed. I would think 90% of the people will use it, including myself. So everything I'm going to do today is going to be with ready mix filler rather than the powdered stuff. Before we fill these holes, let's just talk a little bit about filling knives. Now, I don't think it really matters what type of knife you use, as long as that front edge is flat, straight, and nice and tidy. For obviously, you want a knife that's going to be at least as wide as the hole you're filling. So for small holes, this is absolutely fine. For something a little bit bigger, you're going to be wanting something that looks a bit more like a wallpaper scraper, and something for fairly major, you're going to need like a plastering knife like this. Also, that front edge is really important. So if you've got any rust or it's not that clean, a little tip, just get a bit of sandpaper or sanding pad like this and just run it across that front edge on both sides, and you'll soon get a nice bright sharp front edge, which is going to help the finish of your filler. I'm not going to need very much for these holes, so I'm just going to pull it straight out of the tube and just start forcing some into this hole. And gradually I'll just push more and more in there, so at least I've got maybe 10 mil, half an inch worth of filler in there. Just keep forcing it in rather than just being on the surface. Got a better chance of not cracking and not going anywhere then. Now I've got enough in, I just want to clean my knife and do the last couple of passes. Now sometimes you can see it pulling away from the edge there. If I pull down, then the top tends to come away. And a little trick to get around that is to actually start in the middle and pull down, and then start in the middle, pull up. And if you do that a few times, you can find yourself a little bit more successful than just going over the whole thing. Sometimes it doesn't pull away from the edge if you do it in different directions. You see that top there's just started to pull away. So once again, I'll start in the middle and see if I can force it to each edge. Filler does tend to have a certain bounce to it, so it does tend to want to come back out of you, even if the hole is going into a void. Now, I'm going to leave it like that. Just once again, tidy up around the edges. I don't need any more than what's in the hole. So obviously a very quick process, and I'm going to have to come back when this is dry to do a bit of sanding. And I'm sorry to have to break it to you, but if you want them perfect, the chances of doing it in one go is very slim, should I say. The chances of it having a little divot and shrinking, like I said, the ready mix generally does, is extremely high. So what I'm planning to do with this, wait until it dries, do a bit of sanding, take anything that's above the surface off, and then do another little bit of refilling and letting that dry and sanding again. Right, let's move on to something a little bit bigger. And the strategy for this is a little bit different, because we can't just force filler into a hole of this size and hope that it doesn't just fall out the back and into the cavity. We have to have something to restrain it, else we're just going to be putting it into a void and it will never fill up, and it never fill properly. So let me show you what I like to use as a backing to the filler. So what I've got here is I've got some paper towel that I'm putting in a plastic bag, and then essentially just forcing it into that hole. So we've got a backing for the filler to push against without just going through to the void. And the reason I'm using a plastic bag is that, I mean, it's traditionally you get a paper towel and you shove it in there to stop the filler going any further, but the paper towel is obviously highly absorbent, and when you put the filler in there, it can really suck everything, all that moisture into it, and you end up with even more cracking. If you just pop it inside a paper bag, then you've got the pressure of the paper towel but actually no absorption because you've got plastic. So now and just trim that edge, make sure there's nothing sticking out, and fill it almost in the same way as these small holes. There we go, that's about filled and level with the surface. Although I'm pretty aware that that is going to shrink, so we're going to come back to that, do a little bit of sanding, come back to that and give it another filling up. The last repair I've got here is about 4 inches across, which is far too big to be able to use a bag like I did last time to support the filler. Now a repair like this, anything from about 3 inches up to something fairly big, or maybe an inspection hole that you've had to cut out at the back of the sink or the dishwasher or something, really needs to be supported by more plasterboard rather than just lots and lots of filler. So I'm going to use this small piece of plasterboard as a patch essentially in this hole. Now if you need some plasterboard, you don't need to buy a full 8x4 sheet. The DIY shops sell quarter sheets, so you just buy a quarter of an 8x4 sheet, use a little bit off the corner. If you keep it somewhere dry like the loft or garage or something, then you can use it to years to come if you've got any more damage. So what I'm going to do with this is I've cut this slightly bigger than the hole. I'm going to offer it up to the hole, mark around it, and then cut out the hole. So the hole is now around or just slightly bigger than my patch. Then I'm going to put a couple of timber battens in here and screw it to the wall, and then I can screw this to it and then make good around it. Now I'm going to use a lot more filler on this one. So this time I'm actually going to be using jointing compound. Jointing compound, whether it be the powdered form like Easy Fill or something like this that's ready mix, is very, very similar to repair filler that I've just been using. So if you want to use a lot, it's in some ways cheaper to buy this. I've just got this because I've been doing plasterwork around the house recently, so if I need a good splodge of it, it's easier to get it out of this rather than my little tube. Right, let's get the little bits of timber and get them screwed into this. Once you've done this a couple of times, it's not nearly as scary as it looks. Just make sure that you're using the same thickness plasterboard for the patch as the original, and also it doesn't sit forward of the original. Trim things to fit, leaving the patch just a few millimeters smaller all the way round the hole, which can then be filled in with filler to make a really strong bond. With the patch secure, the gaps around the perimeter can then be filled and smoothed off the best you can. Now, I did make a comment at the beginning about this being potentially easier for us to get a nice finish rather than for our American cousins in the States. Rather than me trying to explain what I meant by that here, let's have some graphics. This is a cross section through a stud wall with the plasterboard screwed onto the studs. And the difference between the UK and the US is that in the UK we still tend to finish all our walls with a thin layer of plaster, maybe up to 2 or 3 millimeters, which isn't generally done in the US. This means for a repair that needs mesh tape on the surface to ensure it doesn't re-crack, rather than having to feather out the repair so you can't see it like they do in the US, you can use the thickness of the plaster in front of the plasterboard to hide the mesh and then just finish off easily using the plaster either side as a guide. So this has now been left for 24 hours, so it's time to do a little bit of sanding. And I must say, I always really enjoy using sanding pads rather than sandpaper and a block. I just find them easier because they're already flat to start with. Now, you can get away with the small areas using a sanding pad, but for something big, you really need a sander like this. And if you're going to use something like this, remember to hook it up to dust extraction and definitely wear a mask. Because they've shrunk a touch, I need to fill them again to bring each one to surface level, which is easily done with a small amount of filler, and this time won't pull away from the surface. The medium-sized hole you can see has shrunk significantly because of the larger volume of material that we started with, which again is easily filled with a couple of passes. The larger patch I sand with the Orbit sander before filling the areas that are low. So this now is the second pass, and I can feel that they're really flat at all. There's no indentation now like there was on the first one. It's just a little bit of roughness, which shouldn't take too much to get rid of with a sander like that. That is now really very smooth. I can't feel anything on that at all. So it doesn't take much, and you really do need 2 passes, I think, to get to that stage, and that is really bang on. And this one as well, once again, is absolutely flush with the surface, although it's a little bit not particularly smooth. It doesn't take much to change that. Now that is really flush. You should be able to see it if I do my little trick. Even on this bigger one, it's getting pretty flat now, so rather than using the circular random Orbit sander, I'm just going to do it by hand. Just a couple of little areas here, and those areas are so small, I'm just going to do it with a small knife. I'm not going to need to have a big knife. It's just a couple of little areas here, and where I filled the screw holes as well. And that is pretty much there. So I'll come back to that in 24 hours, give it a really light sand. That's all it needs now, and it'll be ready to paint over. If you want to make sure that these sort of areas have got the same texture as your walls, I highly recommend using a roller, even if it's just a small 4-inch roller in that area, rather than that being flat and everything being slightly textured. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you next time.